Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Swale, and this is my final project for Indigenous Resistance 3450A with Dr. Paul Mackenzie Jones. Today, I'm going to walk you through some examples of Indigenous resistance through women and nursing. These are some stories that I've collected of resistance through healthcare, medicine, and healing. And before I get into that, I just would like to say I'd like to recognize my privilege as a descendant of white settler Canadians on this land. And as I go through this today, I just want to be respectful and aware of what my role is in this as an Indigenous ally, as well as the struggle of Indigenous peoples to this point. And I don't want to glaze over that. I just want to acknowledge it and put it right out there, right off the bat. Okay, so the focus of my study is from approximately 1900, 1910 to 1920, a little bit into the 1920s. So basically the First World War era, leading up to and a little bit after. I'm going to talk about Indigenous women and the extensive sacrifices that they made during the war, not only fighting for their people, but fighting for a system that was ultimately seeking to destroy them, which is pretty incredible when you begin to look at it. The modern institution or professional definition of a nurse is kind of exclusive. So I just want to, I know we've talked about that in class a bit, but I want to call that out right off the bat and kind of say that nurses can't be defined through only the Western definition of this. So again, I know this has been a topic in class, but it's just important to kind of to put it out there right away. I also don't want to paint all Indigenous peoples with the same brush. I know, we've probably talked about this in class a bit, but it's important to give credit to each individual's unique experience of each individual tribe and nation, and not sort of group all Indigenous peoples into one group, because that can be damaging as well. So I just wanted to call that out as I go through this. And there might be some points in time where I refer to things as Indigenous people as a whole, because there was themes that I've seen and in tying the resistance efforts together. I thought that was important, but I just wanted to say ultimately I want to pay respect to each individual person, tribe, nation individually too. All right, so I have sort of 5 points as my rationale for, and like I said, a little bit assumptions for resistance through medicine. It's important as I go through this that the recorded oral histories and other research that's been done, it was hard to uncover a lot of this information. It was kind of like a rabbit hole. It was really cool doing the readings and research. When I get to the end, you'll see I have used quite a number of sources to come up with this work. But a lot of the time, researchers have relied on oral histories or alternative form of digging into history to find this information, because it's not just right there and easily accessible. So researchers such as, I'm just going to name some last names, Burnett, McCallum, and Kelm and Best have really worked hard to uncover a lot of this information. So the basis for using healthcare and nursing as resistance. So first, Indigenous women in Canada have been critical, and not only in Canada, in other nations as well, other Indigenous nations around the world. There's evidence to show that they're critical to their communities as traditional healers, healthcare providers, activists, as well as spiritual guides. The strong reputation of Indigenous women as healers, like I said, their voices have often been muted or attempted to be erased. So in the book, Taking Medicine, Women's Healing Work and Colonial Contract in Southern Alberta, 1880 to 1930, Canadian author and PhD Kristen Burnett argues, which I'm also going to argue here today, that women in early settlement era relied heavily on Aboriginal women for moments of health crisis, particularly when it came to complicated childbirths. The healing or this opportunity provided cross-cultural exchange of information, which we'll see in a number of areas where Indigenous women have integrated themselves into the healthcare system and integrated Indigenous health practices into sort of Western medicine. The third sort of argument or basis I'm going to say is the development of Western medical institutions relied heavily on female labor. So this is where we saw not only Indigenous women working in hospitals, but also white women. And so women, Indigenous women became trained in the system. It kind of leads on to, to another point. But women were trained as nurses to resist sort of the systematic attempts to erase them, push them out of society. So they persisted, and they showed up in ways that enabled them to practice their trade as caregivers and healers. And finally, we see resistance through establishment of hospitals. One example in particular that I'll talk about, but all these sort of are the key rationale for medicine, resistance through medicine. Okay, so we're going to start in the United States, and like I said, I have said this before, but despite the government and church policy to eradicate Indigenous healing, Aboriginal midwifery and healthcare practices have continued. We still see these today, and have been integrated into our healthcare system as a form of medical pluralism in which Aboriginal people have chosen therapeutic forms based on their own physical, cultural, and individual needs. It is really important to say this before I fully dig into this, because this is evidence of how Indigenous people have persisted and resisted and left their mark on history. Although it may not be super evident in the way history is written, it is there when you go looking for it. So each of these examples are examples of resistors or resistance from the settler state. They might not be, like I say, remembered as resistors, but that is what I believe they were. Starting in the United States, I'm just gonna talk about the story of Cora Elm. So Cora Elm was part of the Oneida Reservation, and she lived in sort of the late 19th century, or was born in the late 19th century, and this was part of the Iroquois Confederacy. Her grandmother was a midwife, and she grew up on a farm in the Onondaga, with the Onondaga tribe or nation, and her grandmother was a well-known midwife. Cora then went on to be trained as a nurse at the Episcopal Hospital in Philadelphia. Excuse my pronunciation. I have looked up some of these, but I might struggle with a few. After finishing her studies in 1914, where she excelled, she went on to several practicums, and not long after the war broke out. So in March 1917, the U.S. joined the war, and in December 1917, Cora Elm volunteered and sailed over to Liverpool, where she served in a U.S. hospital. Not only did she serve during the First World War, but she continued on after, and she was part of a hospital brigade that cared for over 9,000 patients. She talked about how she encountered many soldiers that took a psychological toll, and when she came back to the States, she continued her practice. She got married, but then she had a child, but she continued to practice nursing until 1942. There's an interview with her where she talks about how she faced a lot of discrimination, and people were often surprised, didn't understand how she'd become trained. But she had support of some people in her family and some wealthy people that knew her during her training, helped push her forward. So she did give sort of credit to people who helped her along the way, but I also think it's credit to her incredible determination to become trained herself. Moving over to Canada, I wanted to do Canada right after the U.S. because it was very interesting. So Charlotte Edith Anderson Montour, she is an incredible example of someone who was extremely determined to become trained as a nurse. She was raised on the Six Nations Grand River Reserve, which is out in Ontario. She was born in 1890. She was not able to actually be trained as a nurse anywhere in Canada. So she went to the States and attended the nursing school in New York State and became a registered nurse in 1914. So would have been at the age of 24. By 19, and this is right around almost the exact time that Cora Elm was trained. In 1917, she was 27 at the time. She and 19 other nurses, 14 who were also Canadian, joined the U.S. Medical Corps. At this point, this is where they went overseas to serve in World War One, and she spent most of her time treating soldiers who'd been shot or gassed. She lived until 1983. She lived to be over 93. They talk about an interview with her on one of the websites that I looked into her on, and she just speaks about caring for people and the awful sights, the rubble, the burnt trees, shells all over the place, towns blown up. She had an incredible memory. So she shared her stories through oral history with people who were willing to listen right until she was 93, which was really incredible. And she continued working as a nurse on reserve hospitals in Canada until 1955, and she had 4 children. I'm going to move on to another example in Canada of the Blackfoot Hospital. This was a really interesting example, and I'd hope to find other examples of hospitals in other countries, but unfortunately I didn't. I came across this one, and it was built in 1924 by the Siksika people, and it was their own initiative. It was a 16-bed Blackfoot Hospital. It was unique as it was the only band-owned hospital in Western Canada, as well as only one of 2 in the whole country. The Siksika agreed to fund the hospital on the condition that Indigenous healers and midwives would be allowed to continue their practice. So they had to get basically permission from the state to be able to do this. And the hospital lasted for 30 years and served reserve communities. They developed a medical synchronism of what we talked about kind of earlier, where they were able to combine Western medicine with Indigenous healing and basically fight colonialism in this way. It was an incredible example of resistance. Unfortunately, Indian Health Services in Canada did not like that the nation was running their own hospital, and ultimately the hospital was shut down by the government after World War II. But it really was, I wanted to find more evidence and dig into it. There's a book that's been written on hospitals in Canada and Indigenous healing and medicine that I do recommend. I'll talk a little bit about my sources at the end, but yeah, it was a really incredible story. Moving on to New Zealand. So Akene High, she was, and she was kind of known as the first Maori nurse to be registered as a nurse using her Maori name. Interestingly enough, as a side note, nurses that were sort of claimed to be, say, the first nurses in history or that kind of thing, one of the authors talks about that I read into talks about being really careful when we talk about this, because she certainly wasn't the first Maori nurse. There were thousands of years of history of nurses and healers and healthcare workers in terms of that definition. But she, in terms of Western medicine, was the first to be recognized. So again, it's certainly not the first Maori nurse. It was just under British colonization first to be recognized and fight that system of colonization. She didn't actually, she faced an enormous amount of resistance to her becoming a nurse. So she became a nurse finally at the age of 30, and she was only one of 3 nurses of the Maori Health Nursing Scheme, which was shortly after she became a nurse, closed down by the health department due to lack of Maori nurses to staff it because these Maori nurses could not get trained. Akenahe High was born in the Bay of Plenty in the 1870s. She was well educated. Her greatest difficulty was balancing the demands of European-based nursing training with Maori traditions. But she fought for this. She fought strongly to keep Maori traditions. And she was an inspiration to other nurses, other Maori nurses. Her influence persisted long after her death. Unfortunately, she died quite young of typhoid, but she really inspired other Maori nurses to continue working to integrate Western nursing practices with traditional Maori practices. Another story that comes from New Zealand I did want to touch on, there's not a lot of information on this, but the Ngāpuhi sisters were five Maori women that wanted to serve in wars overseas because Maori men were fighting overseas for the British. These women were incredibly determined, and because Maori or women in general weren't allowed to fight in wars, they believed that they would be successful nurses for their own people. So they started their own group. It became sort of a volunteer group, and they wanted to bring their knowledge and skills to Western nursing as Maori women. As you can see, the women in this photo are a range of ages, and it's not fully known their story, but they wanted to be accepted into the army, and they fought because they were turned down from being accepted into the army. They fought that by being trained as nurses. The conditions for employment as nurses was quite strict, and the qualifications or opportunities for training weren't available to Maori women. But the Ngāpuhi sisters were not discouraged. These women were descendants of great matriarchs and strong grandmothers and mothers who showed them that it was of key importance for caring for the sick and wounded. They expressed their support for the British Army, but then they formed their own contingent of volunteers, complete with uniforms, ranks, and then military drills, which is really cool. They sort of, one description of them described them as well-mounted, good horsewomen, ready to attend to the sick and wounded, both on the battlefield and in their own communities. There's no evidence to show they ever made it to see war, but they, again, certainly were an example of strong resistors who believed in fighting for their people and for their rights. So Australia, again, prior to invasion, Aboriginal peoples had strong practices in their own approach to medicine and healthcare. Healthcare knowledge was passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition, as we see evidence in other Indigenous nations as well, and in Indigenous tribes. Medicines for health resources were often available locally through foraging or from the land, learning from the land, healing from the land. Aboriginal people, for Aboriginal people, hospitals with professional staff and nurses and doctors didn't really make any sense. This is not how they practice medicine. In addition, the Western approach of treating illness didn't fit well with the holistic approaches of Aboriginal healthcare healers. It was quite hard to find examples of Australian women as nurses. However, a professor named Odette Bast, who is a First Nations woman herself and a registered nurse, she's been gathering stories of untold Aboriginal women as healers, as caregivers, from basically the 1890s to the 1950s, and she's trying to write this part of Australian history that's been largely erased or untold. But so one of the women that I did come across, and I didn't find a photo of her, so that's not who's shown here, but May Yarrowick, was an Aboriginal woman whose mother was Aboriginal, father was a European settler, and she was trained as a nurse in 1907 and served across Australia. She faced a large amount of discrimination and resistance to her becoming a trained nurse, but she was able to fight and gain her qualification and serve the Australian people. Now, there wasn't really much to say whether this was on reserves, or, as we know, there's not really so much. The way things happen in Australia was a bit different, but she was an Indigenous trained healer, and around the same time as the other women that I've spoken about, around sort of that World War I era. So proof that nursing is a form of resistance came a little bit later in the 1970s. So the reason I just bring this up, I know this is sort of out of the scope of what we're talking about, but I just wanted to show this as a little bit of evidence to show how nursing has really truly become a form of resistance for Indigenous women. So movements in the 1970s, such as the Registered Nurses of Canada Indian Ancestry, so this is what it was originally called. They are basically organizations of nurses that identified themselves as observers of inequalities in healthcare, and stated that Native women have their own awareness of needs of their people. They stood in the fight for Indigenous people's right to self-determination in 1969. And from this, other groups have formed in the 70s around the world. So there was the National Council of Maori Nurses, as well as the American Indian Nurses Association. And like I said, I think this is just the stories I told today are sort of the root of these movements. These movements have continued on into the 70s and into today, although I didn't look into it much today. But that just goes to show that these women were sort of the early resistors and provided inspiration for women that has carried forward into the modern era. So kind of tying it all together, just a quote from a woman named Lana Ray, who's an Indigenous woman in Canada, talking about healthcare. So before colonization, and heteropatriarchy disrupted our traditional ways of knowing and being. Indigenous women held prominent positions within nations in Canada and communities. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But ultimately, women used to be primarily responsible for teaching and caring for the day-to-day needs of their community and healing, and they were also had many governing responsibilities. So I just think that gender roles and women as matriarchal leaders was very much sort of often seen in Indigenous tribes and communities in history. And these women, although this is post-colonization, obviously, late 19th century, early 20th century, these women were trying to carry on traditional practices of Indigenous healing and Indigenous women so that they could resist the system and the fight. The oral traditions of medicine and different things that we've seen today just go to show how these things have been carried on. The solidarity and service to the settler state and to Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to point out how the service of these Indigenous women, especially in the First World War, were to a state that was trying to destroy them. These women were serving often white men, white settlers, and basically the nation state of Canada or the US or Australia, New Zealand, and yet they were loyal and cared for all around them. So evidence of these movements were leaned towards Indigenous healthcare sovereignty. So they were ultimately trying to embed Indigenous healthcare practices into Western practices. And it's really incredible that, like I say, especially in midwifery, we see examples still today of how Indigenous peoples have influenced healthcare in Canada. I wasn't able to dig into that, but it is there. So in conclusion, I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit long here, but I will wrap this up here. The long-standing history of Indigenous women in nursing is a very moving and compelling story. I've loved learning about this and researching it and trying to figure out more of stories of women who have been muted and not told necessarily. I believe these women, although history hasn't remembered them as resistors necessarily, that is exactly what they were. They were Indigenous women seeking to continue traditions of healthcare and healing of people through colonialist structures of the state that did not allow them to practice their trade in the traditional ways of Indigenous peoples. Each of these women embodied the strong characteristics of healing the sick and caring for those around them. Indigenous women were resisting colonial attempts to control them, and they fought to be trained as nurses to overcome the control of the state while still operating within it. Yeah. So as a final note, like I said, there's strong evidence also of oral histories throughout all of this work and of the persistence of women as healers, as caregivers, and that evidence still today shows up in modern medicine. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. I really enjoyed researching and learning about this. I hope I did justice to it by speaking about it through this presentation and podcast. It was a little bit different outside of my normal scope of how I might write a paper, but I did really want to give this a try. There's a number of books here, a couple in particular that I looked into. So McCallum, 2014 Indigenous Women, Work in History. I used that book quite a bit. It was very, very interesting. Mary Ellen Kelm, Taking Medicine, Women's Healing Work in Colonial Contract in Southern Alberta. I got little excerpts from that. It was really interesting. It's all like digging into this. There's so much information, so much out there. If it interests you, I really encourage you to continue on and maybe take what I've done here and build off it on another project or something, potentially another class. But it was really, really cool. References, web sources as well. This is just sort of for photo credit, that kind of thing, extra information that I got from different museum websites and so on. And that pretty much is the last of my sources. Thank you everyone for listening. Sorry I went a little bit long on this, but I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. I know I learned a lot. Really appreciate it.